Since President Trump took office, this administration has routinely ignored court orders, prompting judges across the country to threaten government lawyers with contempt for their abject failure to comply with the law. And just this week, President Trump revived his big lie that the 2020 election was stolen when it was not. This lie led to the greatest assault on American democracy since the Civil War, the insurrection of January. Mr. Chairman, thank you, Ranking Member. I want to start by, you saw the presentation of the award, but I want to express my appreciation for the bipartisan work that Chairman Diaz-Balart and Ranking Member Frankel have. The relationship has been proved to accomplish much on this subcommittee, especially as it relates to the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED. I'm very proud they were able to come together earlier this year on a funding bill that rejects the cuts to the NED, sending a strong signal to this White House and to the world that the United States Congress remains committed. We are committed to supporting democracy around the globe. I thank you, Mr. Wilson, for answering the questions before the subcommittee today. I thank you for the work that you do as president and CEO of the endowment. And if you'll indulge me for a second, I see in the audience a young man who I worked with for years when I first came to the Congress, and that's Jerry Hartz, who's with NDI. And we conspired and did many things together, including helping to bring about the end of the war in Nicaragua. So hats off, Jerry. All around the world, the National Endowment for Democracy provides indispensable support for advocates of the essential freedoms that we cherish here at home: freedom of speech, the press, religion, assembly, the freedom to choose our leaders, chase our dreams without the fear of oppression. In 2024 alone, the NED made over 1,900 grants across 91 countries, providing over $286 million in aid to organizations that work to advance democracy from the bottom up, and oftentimes risking their lives to do so. They are in dangerous areas. Sometimes we lose sight of that in the United States, of how dangerous the situations are, that people that we send there are and what their environment is all about, because we believe that we have a safe environment here in which to conduct our democracy, and we need to keep it so. Groups backed by the NED have been instrumental in documenting the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of religious minorities, reporting on mass internment camps, abuse of Muslim women for wearing hijabs, and the imprisonment of Christian leaders. In Sudan, groups that received support from the NED bore witness to the atrocities committed during the ongoing civil war and were key to the U.S. government's determination last year that the rapid support forces are committing genocide. And in Russia, where Putin's regime has imprisoned countless dissidents for no crime other for their beliefs, the NED was able to sustain legal support and advocacy for over 1,500 political prisoners. These are brave men and women. They stand up for their own freedom and for that of their country, carry forward the hope that is the foundation of any democracy. Unfortunately, the world is experiencing a resurgence of autocracy and authoritarianism, making support for freedom and democracy around the globe more important than ever. And as the world's wealthiest and most powerful democracy, we have an obligation to set an example here at home. We must model the values and practices that we push for internationally: free and fair elections, due process, and the rule of law, essential, inviolable rights that protect our most essential freedoms. Sadly, this administration has set the wrong example and has modeled behavior we would historically have condemned had it occurred in another country. The president last week attacked in personal terms several Supreme Court justices for blocking his illegal taxes on American consumers, preventing him from raising costs on working families even more than he already has. Since President Trump took office, this administration has routinely ignored court orders, prompting judges across the country to threaten government lawyers with contempt for their abject failure to comply with the law. And just this week, President Trump revived his big lie that the 2020 election was stolen when it was not. This lie led to the greatest assault on American democracy since the Civil War, the insurrection of January 6th. I believe that America is exceptional, that we are the greatest nation on earth, and we can achieve anything that we set our minds to, if we put our differences aside and pursue it together. In a much narrower sense, the work of this subcommittee is evidence of that we can bridge our differences for the common good. But this exceptionalism comes with responsibility. Through our actions, we can either lend credibility to the corruption and oppression of dictatorships or the abundance and freedom of democracy. It is my hope that through the good work of independent organizations like the NED, the United States may be able to reclaim some of the credibility this administration has squandered overseas. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, your full written statement will be placed on the records. Obviously, feel free to summarize your testimony. You're now recognized, sir.
Moments ago, in a chamber meant to symbolize the steadiness of American governance, a stark warning was delivered. The words were deliberate, measured, but unmistakably urgent. This administration has set the wrong example. That was the charge. Not whispered in the margins, but spoken plainly before Congress, entered into the record, and directed squarely at the conduct of the President of the United States. Representative Rosa DeLauro stood not merely to discuss appropriations or foreign policy grants, but to draw a line between principle and power. She praised bipartisan cooperation on preserving funding for the National Endowment for Democracy, an institution that in 2024 alone distributed over 1,900 grants across 91 countries, investing more than $286 million in organizations advancing democratic governance from the ground up. She reminded the room that these efforts support freedom of speech, religious liberty, open elections, and the rule of law, the very pillars America claims to champion. But then her tone shifted, because the hearing was not only about what America funds abroad, it was about what America practices at home. DeLauro alleged that this administration has routinely ignored court orders, that judges across the country have had to threaten government attorneys with contempt for failing to comply with the law, that the president personally attacked Supreme Court justices after they blocked what she described as unlawful taxation policies. And perhaps most consequentially, she pointed to the revival of the claim that the 2020 election was stolen, a claim repeatedly rejected by courts, state officials, and federal investigations. In that moment, the conversation stopped being about line items and became about legitimacy. The United States has long presented itself as the world's most powerful democracy, not only because of its economy or military, but because of its institutions, independent courts, peaceful transfers of power, respect for constitutional limits. When America funds democracy advocates in authoritarian states, it does so under the premise that its own system is worthy of emulation. But what happens when that example is questioned from within? DeLauro's argument was not simply partisan, it was philosophical. She described a world experiencing a resurgence of authoritarianism, where regimes silence dissent, manipulate elections, and suppress independent media. In such an environment, she argued, America's credibility matters more than ever. And credibility, she implied, is not built through speeches abroad, but through conduct at home. If court orders are disregarded, if election outcomes are cast into doubt without evidence, if judicial independence is attacked when rulings are unfavorable, then the moral authority to lecture others begins to erode. The hearing exposed a tension that has defined this era of American politics. On one side, the belief that strong executive action is necessary to reshape government and challenge entrenched institutions. On the other, the conviction that even the most powerful office in the land must remain bound by judicial oversight and constitutional restraint. This is not a new debate, but it is one that feels increasingly existential. The National Endowment for Democracy operates in places where dissent can lead to imprisonment, where speaking out against the ruling power carries profound consequences. DeLauro reminded the chamber that in Russia, the organization has supported advocacy for more than 1,500 political prisoners. That in Sudan, supported groups documented atrocities during civil conflict. That in China, grants helped document persecution and systemic repression. These are not abstract initiatives. They are acts rooted in the belief that democratic norms are universal and that America has a duty to defend them. Yet DeLauro's central warning was that democracy cannot be exported while it is weakened at home. When a president disputes certified election results, when compliance with court rulings becomes negotiable, when the language used against judges turns personal rather than constitutional, The signal sent abroad is not strength, it is uncertainty. America's exceptionalism, she argued, is not a birthright. It is conditional. It depends on whether its leaders model the values they promote: free and fair elections, due process, the rule of law. If those principles falter domestically, the entire framework of American leadership abroad becomes fragile. This is the deeper meaning of the exchange we witnessed. Not a clash over funding, not merely partisan criticism, but a struggle over the example the United States sets in a world watching closely. History teaches that democracies rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They erode gradually, through normalization of extraordinary claims, through resistance to judicial limits, through rhetoric that frames institutional checks as personal attacks. The question raised in this hearing is whether America is drifting toward that erosion or recommitting itself to its constitutional foundations. DeLauro concluded with hope that independent institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy could help restore credibility where it has been diminished. That bipartisan cooperation on this subcommittee proves that common ground is still possible. That the American system, though strained, is resilient enough to correct itself. But hope requires vigilance, because democracy is not self-sustaining. It relies on citizens who demand accountability, on leaders who respect constraints, on courts whose rulings are followed, even when inconvenient, and on a public willing to distinguish between loyalty to an individual and loyalty to the Constitution. The hearing has adjourned. The statements have been entered into the record. But the larger debate continues in courtrooms, in state houses, and in the minds of millions of Americans deciding what kind of republic they want to preserve. In the end, the example America sets will not be defined by speeches about freedom abroad. It will be defined by whether freedom's rules are honored here at home. And that responsibility does not belong to one party, one administration, or one moment in time. It belongs to all of us. If you believe transparency matters, if you believe constitutional limits must apply to everyone, if you believe democracy deserves both defense and accountability, subscribe to Liberty Report USA. Support our work to expose the truth.